Good morning and welcome everyone to another Secura webinar. This will be about how to get the most out of your pen test. The talk will be given by Ralph and myself will be moderating. So I still see people joining, but because it's time, I propose to let's start. Okay. So very quickly about me, my name is Peter. I'm a penetration tester. I've been working for over 6 years now as a penetration tester. Mainly today I will be moderating, looking at the questions, and then passing them over to Ralph for him to answer. And for Ralph, he has over 30 years of experience working as the technical director here at Secura, and he will be the main speaker during this presentation. Shortly about Secura, before we get into the main part. Secura is a digital security expert company since 2000 with a mission to provide insight into digital security. Now, the main approach of how we do this is to link to international standards, metrics, certifications to provide qualitative measures and outputs when we do any of our reports, any of our assignments, and to do it in a holistic manner, so not only look at technology, but also look at the processes and the people that work within those companies. As you can see, we have a overview of the services that we sell, and the main part that I would talk about is we have different market groups working for public, finance, technology, industrial, etc. And as you can see, while we mainly will be talking about penetration testing today, we do a lot of other things as well, including forensics, audit advisory, assurance certifications, and behavioral trainings as well. And yeah, that's it. So let's jump into the agenda. I will pass it over to Ralph from now.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So today, indeed, we will be talking about penetration testing, which is a subject that I've been dealing with for many decades, actually. So I started out myself as, basically a hacker in the 80s, and then rolled into penetration testing pretty soon after. So it's a subject that is very close to my, my training and also my passion and my heart. The agenda for today will cover a couple of topics. So first of all, we'll have a little chat on why we actually are doing this security testing, this penetration testing. We'll talk about the risks, threats, and vulnerabilities. And the title of the webinar today is how to get the most out of your pen test. So in order to give that a bit of body, I want to talk about the test approaches. How do you approach a pen test? And well, also about how to prepare for the pen test being done, because of course the output is very much dependent on the preparation. So yeah, if you want to maximize your return on investment, then that would be a good way to start. Prepare well. Obviously, we find stuff. So that could be all kinds of vulnerabilities. And Peter, of course, as one of our senior pen testers, has a lot of experience in finding these kinds of vulnerabilities. But how do you deal with that? And then there are some other things like tips and tricks that I want to also share with you on how to further maximize that return on investment. We find sometimes that customers are slightly hesitant to actually do something with the findings, or maybe make some high-level conclusions about it, and still these are things that we think are very valuable for our customers. And of course I want to look a little bit into the future of pen testing, and also the future of where Secura is going with pen testing, and there will be time for a question and answer session. So to start off, a little introduction on risks, threats, and vulnerabilities. And the first thing, of course, that is important when you are talking about security, and this is not just for security testing, but when we are discussing security in general, is that you should always take into account your threat model. So what do I mean with that? Your threat model basically means what kind of information and assets do you have? What are you protecting them against? Who are you protecting them against, and what is their value? So your threat model will differ if you are an online website doing retail, or versus you are a manufacturer, for instance, and you are trying to protect your intellectual property. And one of the main things, and this will come back later also in certain other aspects of doing penetration testing, is that you have to look at the threat actors. Now, that's a special name or for that we use for who is the attacker. So that could be, you know, your standard garden variety of hackers. We call some of them script kiddies or skids, or just the opportunistic hackers. But of course, with the rise of ransomware now, the organized crime gangs are a significant threat actor. Don't forget the state actors and nation-state proxies, of course. We have quite a few of those. We have hacktivists, and even in some cases, in some threat models, you could see journalists and researchers also being part of your threat actors. Not so much in the negative sense, but especially when dealing with very highly classified information, even those could classify as a threat actor. Terrorists and extremists, of course, also vandals, and don't forget the insider threat, the disgruntled employees. It does happen. So all these actors, they have motives. This could be an economic motive or a military motive or a motive of financial gain. And they will start to attack certain targets. This could be, for instance, your external attack surface, that which is exposed to the internet. It could be an application, but it also could be a physical plant. If you're talking about a manufacturing plant, of course, the intellectual property will be in that plant. So these are aspects to take into account. And of course, you then have to look at, well, how is this being attacked? Are there cases out there? Is there activity being observed by these threat actors? So what aspects should we focus on when we are testing? So a couple of things here. If you're looking at a threat or a vulnerability, is it being actively exploited is, of course, one of the major aspects. So if it's been actively exploited, that means that there is some kind of software program or group out there that knows exactly how to abuse a specific weakness. This information, of course, is certainly sometimes publicly available on the internet, but not always. And then you can also look at the exact steps that these vulnerabilities take, because they are often chained together by these threat actors. So it's not just a question of one vulnerability and they are in. It is often a question of, well, they have an initial foothold because there was a vulnerability, it was exploitable, so they got in through that vulnerability first, and then they leveraged that vulnerability to penetrate further into the network. So if you want to do a security test and a pen test, it is always very good to look at real world exercises. How do threat actors already abuse these vulnerabilities? Because if you don't, it will mostly stay a theoretical exercise, and we will be talking about only potential vulnerabilities. And of course, the way to maximize, or one of the ways to maximize your return on investment, is to talk about practical applicability of these results from the pen test. Talking about vulnerabilities and exploits, most of you will probably know this, but for those of you that don't, there's a couple of standards that we like to use. One of them is the scoring of a vulnerability. We use the CVSS 3 standard for that. So that's a common vulnerability scoring system. And basically what it does, it tells you how bad is a vulnerability. So it could be that a vulnerability scores a 10, which means that it is one of the worst vulnerabilities that is known, and it can lead to direct unauthorized access to a high administrator level on a system or a network. So to give you an example, one of my colleagues last year discovered the zero logon vulnerability, and that was scored a CVSS 10. So that was the highest score. Normally, if you have a web application that has, for instance, a cross-site scripting vulnerability in there, that would rank around a 7 or a 6, depending on the context and the environment. So there is a scoring system there. Another term that you will often hear within pen testing is the CVEs. So those are basically a number and a classification system for vulnerabilities. So a CVE number will be assigned to a specific vulnerability when it is discovered. And well, the number is of course just an index number. So it will be something like CVE 2020 dash and then the index number. So the number in itself doesn't say anything. It's just a way to refer to vulnerabilities. And these vulnerabilities can be exploited. Some of these exploits are even sold commercially, and there's companies that deal with that. Now, I would like to say that Secura typically does not buy or sell vulnerabilities from these companies. We think that the zero-day trade, as it is called, has certain ethical, it crosses certain ethical boundaries for us. So we don't like buying or selling 0 days. However, there are also exploitation frameworks that use exploits that are already public, that are not for sale on the market. So as Metasploit is one of those frameworks, so we do use those, obviously. Then that as a background. So we are talking about exploiting of vulnerabilities. There's scoring systems, there's frameworks out there, but how do you actually go about testing these things? So there's a lot of testing approaches. Before I go into that, I would like to hear from our attendees. Are you familiar, or how familiar are you actually with pen testing? So have you ever had a pen test done on your systems? Never, or many times? I believe currently the poll is popped up. Yes. So let's see how we go. How often have you had anything pen tested? Clickety click, everyone's clicking. I don't see any results yet. All right, where are my results? Here we are. Often. Oh, look, we have lots of experienced pen testees. 62% tell me that they have often had a pen test done. 15% once, and still a sizable, nearly 1/4 of our attendees has never had a pen test done before. Okay, well, that's good information. So I will maybe go into a little more detail on some of the basics then, since 1/4 of our audience has never had a pen test done. That's very interesting to learn. The first thing that I want to talk about is the type of testing. So the type of testing is very closely related to the goal of the test. And you might say, well, the goal is obvious, to find weaknesses. Yes, that is true. But there can be secondary goals, and it's also a question of formulating the exact goal. So it could be to test the effectiveness of measures. Yes, obviously. Find vulnerabilities. Yeah. And sometimes there is already the knowledge that there might be a vulnerability, and the goal is more to prove the existence of the vulnerability, or to provide remediation advice, so mitigation advice, how to fix things. It could also be a question of wanting to train developers or providing security assurance. And an assurance level, of course, is something more than just providing advice. It is telling you it is secure up to a certain level. The second aspect, of course, is that you have to look at what is the object of testing, the TOE, as we say. It could be an application or a complete network. It could also be a device, so maybe an IoT device, or a server, an infrastructure. It could be an abstract thing like a protocol, or it could be an application or a complete cloud environment. And as we see often, it can also be a combination of all of the above and variations. So it is not always the case that we pen test, let's say, a web application. Of course, that happens a lot, but often also on an internal pen test, for instance, it is an internal network with all kinds of applications and servers and protocols and everything in there. So it's not just one aspect, it could be many aspects at the same time. The third thing is to look at how do we approach this test? Well, typically we see three types of testing, so static versus dynamic testing. And static testing would be where we, for instance, have an executable, a piece of software. It could also be a piece of source code, so not in the running form, but actually the source code, and we could do a static analysis on that binary or source code. The other aspect there is that it can be dynamic, so you can actually run it and then observe its behavior. And how we usually test is in a more interactive way. So when it comes down to an application, at least, we will have that running in an acceptance environment or in production, and we can actually interactively test against that. So filling in fields and observing the behavior of an application. The second aspect that's important is the amount of information that we have up front. The more information we have up front, the more we can test, obviously, and we'll get to that into more detail in the next slide. But one thing to take into account is that an attacker, and this goes back to, of course, the first slide where we looked at the threat actors, and a typical attacker will have a lot more time on his hands than we do. So when the testers are actually testing, and we're supposed to test an application in 5 days, then it doesn't help if we have to spend 4 days figuring out how the application works. An attacker in the wild, of course, will have way more time for this. So we're already at a 3-0 setback here. And of course, another aspect is to look at, well, is this actually an internal application or an external application? And do we have to be on site, or do we have to have the actual application in our hands to be able to do any meaningful testing? As I said, a little more detail on the types of testing and the information up front. So typically, if we do not have any information up front, just maybe a target URL or an IP address or literally a black box, a device, without any information up front, this can be a sensible test in some cases, because it will answer the question, what would a Joe random hacker from the internet be able to do on my system? However, since we cannot usually log in to an application when it is just sitting there, especially if it has at least half-assed measures for protection of let's say password security, well, then we will not find a username and a password. We will not be able to log into the application, and we will not be able to test all kinds of application logic that is behind the login page. So black box testing has its uses, but the results will be quite limited. This is why we usually, especially for web applications, advise to go for at least a gray box approach, where we get the credentials, where we get test logins, and where we might be able to test much more. So that saves us time, and it provides much more meaningful results in the end. Of course, we can go a step further, and this is the case where we receive pretty much all information about the application, including the source code, including design documentations and how it is embedded in the infrastructure. This, in the end, tests with the same perspective as a developer would. It provides the best output. It also takes longer. But we do prefer it, and especially when it comes to high sensitive information. So whenever the application or the environment, for instance, is processing sensitive personal information like medical information or financial information, we would always prefer to do this in a crystal or a white box type of test, simply because it provides the best results, and the most vulnerabilities will be found in the shortest amount of time. So that's all aspects that we take into account, and you should also, when you are requesting a pen test from any company, including us. The other thing is to look at the depth of testing versus the width of testing. Sometimes our customers want to know, well, if an attacker is coming from the internet, what could they do? So obviously we would have to test very widely, not just the web application or the main website, but maybe also mail server or all kinds of things that are out there that you might not even know are out there. For instance, if you have a cloud environment on Amazon and you have your data in buckets there, that could be exposed without you knowing it. It's not even part of your own on-premise infrastructure, but we have to throw the net wide to find these things. And another aspect to look is that if you do it in a wide way, then manual testing might not always be the best approach, at least initially. Of course, we always do some manual testing, but if the attack surface from the internet is so large, then you will have to do some kind of automated testing. Which brings me to the tools. So they are necessary. I mean, we have to automate a lot of what we do, but the tools are quite limited. They don't know the business logic. They don't know about authorizations that should be in the application. So consider, for instance, the situation where you have a financial application and user 1 is allowed to initiate a transaction and user 2 has to approve that transaction. Now, let's say there's a business logic error in the application and those two options are available to one user. So that means that one user could initiate and approve a financial transaction. This, of course, is a business logic failure. Tools will not find these things. Tools do not know that a menu option should not be available to user A or B. So these things will only be found, of course, by a manual test. And another thing to take into account is that tools will always give you false positives. So they will think that a certain vulnerability is there, but in reality, it is not. This could be down to a technical misinterpretation of the reaction of the application, but it could also be other things. So that is why we always go through any tool output that there is, and we validate all those results. So these are, again, things that help you set up the pen test to give maximum results. But then we come, and a lot of people think, ooh, scary, the hackers are coming. But in reality, we're not that scary. So of course, we're a professional organization. We work according to standards and have high ethical values. We're certified, our people are certified, and we provide high quality services. So we're not that scary. The methodologies and standards that we work according to, well, I'll give you a few on this list. So we use testing methodologies such as the OSSTM or the Penetration Testing Execution Standard, the PTES. For us, for applications, the OWASP ASVS standards are very important. They provide levels of assurance. What it is not is testing according to the OWASP Top 10. The OWASP Top 10 is a nice high-level guideline with an abstraction of types of vulnerabilities. But yeah, I always have to laugh a bit when customers ask me, so can you make us OWASP Top 10 compliant? Well, do you want us to implement an example of each of those 10 vulnerabilities? No, I don't think so. Other methodologies that we use, for instance, in specific types of testing are the Tiber red teaming standard. I won't go into that into detail now, but red teaming is a different type of test. So in these tests that we do, there's test steps. We do partially discovery and reconnaissance. We do vulnerability testing and then exploitation and actual penetration and then an analysis and report. So there's steps to be done here in a cycle sometimes, especially if we do more continuous testing. the cycle will start again after a few weeks or a few months. Within red teaming, the steps are a little more, well, let's say aggressive, offensive. So we have an actual reconnaissance phase. And of course, we don't just do technical tests within a red teaming attack. We do also social engineering and sometimes even physical attacks, not on people, obviously, but I'm talking about actually testing the physical access controls of a plant or a building. And yeah, we call these steps part of a kill chain. I know, sounds a bit negative, but it's a military term, can't help it. Recon, weaponization, delivery, exploitation, these are all the steps in that kill chain. And in the end, the goal is to get to the data and exfiltrate that. Testers also have certifications. I won't go into detail here again, but there's some entry levels such as CEH and LPT. On the higher level, our testers are certified for OSCP, OSCE, and others. And regional certifications, for instance, CREST in the UK, mean that the company and the testers have passed certain standards and are now allowed to do pen testing on certain environments. So we came and we found stuff. The first thing, of course, as always, don't panic. So what you should be aware of, when we find especially high-risk vulnerabilities, there will always be vulnerabilities, and we found them. Yeah. So before the bad guys did. So don't feel too bad about it. And also realize that if the vulnerabilities are pretty bad, then that's always indicative of something else that is wrong. It is not just that vulnerability, because it means that there is a weak design or bad coding practices or weak vendor management. You have not selected the right tooling for the job. There's all kinds of reasons behind these vulnerabilities being there. And knowing that these vulnerabilities, especially the high-risk vulnerabilities, are actually there, mean that you can then address those underlying issues and, make sure that the future vulnerabilities that are found are much less severe. One or two things about further maximizing your return on investment. So the scoping part of a pen test is pretty important. We've already talked about the targets and technologies and the types of testing, but you should definitely see these also in relationship to each other. So it's not just a question of, this is our website, www.somecustomer.com, please test our website. The other aspects have to be thought of. Also the frequency of testing. If there's not a lot of change and it's pretty static, then once a year is probably enough. However, if your application is being deployed in a CI/CD pipeline and you have releases, multiple times a day, maybe even, then this approach will not be your best case. So think about these things, and also think about these application of standards, especially the ones that I just mentioned, OWASP, ASVS, or if it's a different kind of test, the SIS baselines might also be applicable. So these are more configuration baselines for all kinds of servers and operating systems. And the most important one is actually preparation. So if we have to test something, there has to be something to test. So common issues are that the testing can't be started because the application is being used by other people for testing, or the test credentials don't work, the application hasn't even been deployed yet, or there is no data in the application. That means that certain flows can't even be activated within the application, because that only works if there is actual data. So preparing the test and making sure that there is a good test environment is extremely important. And during execution, a lot can happen. So things can go down. This happens. Often it's unrelated to our testing, but somehow, I don't know, if there's pen testers in the house, we always get the blame. So I've had this happen multiple times. Or the findings are so bad that the application has to be taken offline. So maybe it's already been compromised. And then postponing further testing, yeah, you can avoid it usually, but sometimes we are asked to stop testing for political reasons more than risk reasons. So take care that this can happen, be prepared that during testing things can go wrong. And of course, the follow-up. Once we have provided you with all the measures and the recommendations, don't see it as something that now, so we have a huge problem and we have to fix all these things. You can always turn it around into an opportunity to raise awareness within the company to higher levels, to your C levels, or to get funding for more security or more people, or even, yeah, I mean, even you could even turn it around to ditch some vendor that you wanted to get rid of for a long time, and now you have, the stick to do that with, or apply for better training, because I mean, when there are a lot of vulnerabilities, something of a blame game sometimes starts, and you want to turn that around and make it a more positive thing. So yeah, applying for better training, of course, is always a positive thing. And yeah, of course, improve the products and systems and become more resilient. So having a lot of findings in a pen test report, I mean, it can feel like negative and maybe oh, now I have to do a lot of work to get this all fixed. But in the end, often you can turn it around and make it a really positive thing. So one last thing on hacking the future, some trends and things that we see. We are seeing a much faster adoption and take up of standards, especially the OWASP standards such as ASVS. We are also seeing that testing things in the cloud require different techniques, fundamentally different techniques. And a couple of weeks ago, we did a webinar with my colleague Ricardo on testing, security testing in the cloud, which was also very interesting. And automated, fully continuous testing is, of course, always a thing, and we are also obviously working on that. So a couple of other developments that we are seeing is typically more cyber physical testing. So of course, cyber security is relevant to not just the internet, but actual physical things, ships, buildings, and factories. We're going to pen test a couple of ships soon. How exciting is that? I'm really looking forward to that project. But also hardware testing, so actual testing the hardware of devices. And we've been asked to do all kinds of pen tests, and even on the blockchain applications recently. So Secura performed a smart contract pen test on an Ethereum blockchain Solidity smart contract. That was pretty cool too, I thought. So these are all kinds of new avenues of devices and things that we are being asked to test. If you want to learn more about pen testing, we have a fact sheet on vulnerability assessments and pen testing that covers pretty much a lot of what I presented today. And also you can check out our dedicated service page on secura.com. I think we're ready for some questions now. Maybe just one more thing, that we have a couple of upcoming Secura webinars. On Thursday the 27th, we have medical devices security, and on June 10th, we have a webinar about the UNECE cybersecurity and software update regulation. This is for the automotive sector. So this is where the cars, maybe your Tesla, is getting a software update. Well, that has to be, of course, also compliant to various cybersecurity rules from the UNECE. So that's what this is about. And the 11th of June, we have a webinar about protecting your vital assets. And this has to do with medical data. Very interesting also. Questions and answers. Peter, are there any questions and answers in the box? Loads, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of good questions. So let's start with the first one. We're going back to the scoring system of vulnerabilities, so CVSS, etc. The question was, during a pen test, are vulnerabilities scored based on their inherent risk by Secura without assessing the criticality of the system on which a vulnerability is found, or is there some other method?
That's a good question, because there's a lot of discussion, of course, about how sensible is this scoring.
Exactly.
And some vulnerabilities cannot even be scored, because the CVSS scoring system takes into account certain things. So it takes into account, is it local or remote? Is it Can you get an unauthorized access, or is it more an information leakage kind of thing? Does it apply only to the system under test, or is the scope wider? And all these things are taken into account in the score. But one thing typically is not, and that is, what is the business impact to the customer? So it is an abstraction, this score, and it is not something that says everything about the vulnerability. So it's definitely not the case that it is you know, CVSS 10 might be a CVSS 10 on something that is really insignificant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In our reports, we have to do some of our own judgment on top of that.
Yes. That's also where we add value, of course.
Yeah. Okay. So if you have a follow-up question to that, then put it in here and we can discuss it further. In the meantime, I will jump on to the next one. Another good question: is it good practice to perform a pen test on an application before go live, or does it make more sense to test it in production in the real environment?
Okay, well, that's a difficult question to answer, because I think both have value. First of all, when we test before it goes into production, that gives you, of course, obviously, the chance to fix any major vulnerabilities that are there before someone can access those or exploit those from the internet once it has gone live. On the other hand, we also do find that an application or a system, when it is in production, will not be exactly the same as what we tested when it was still in the acceptance or test environment. So all kinds of environmental issues might mean that firewall settings are different, or the WAF settings are different, or whatever. And this will then skew the picture. So I think that both have its value. And for some things, I would rather test in production, even though there's, you know, associated risks with that also. But in general, I would say that I would always prefer to test something before it goes into production. Yeah, just to be sure.
Yeah. Okay, so another question here. Do you see a trend where the pen testing is also used to test the monitoring and detection capabilities of the organization involved?
Not with pen testing.
Yeah,
no,
that would be red teaming.
That would be red teaming. Yeah. So red teaming is basically a much broader kind of test. We don't just look at application or specific application, but we look at the full attack surface, and that can also include the human factor. So with social engineering, maybe phishing attacks or smishing attacks, or all kinds of ways to get you know, maybe credentials, so call up people, pretend to be the help desk, to have a story ready, and pretend that you need the password, and they will hopefully give you the password. So this is where the detection and response actually comes into play much more than in a pen test, because in a pen test situation, 9 out of 10 times, everyone knows that the pen test is being done. Right, and in a red teaming situation, the blue team, so basically the defenders, they don't always, or they usually don't know that this test is happening. So you will automatically also be testing the response.
Yeah, very much so. Let's see. Okay, for application pen testing, another question came in that we do regular pen tests on our applications, and the goal is to ensure that the application itself does not pose any security risk, of course. And in the feedback, they often get general vulnerabilities for the servers themselves. I assume security misconfigurations and that sort of findings, which is good, but they don't often get application errors. And even themselves, they might find issues that they see are missed in pen tests. So what is something that they can do to help find these kind of application-specific issues in a pen test? Is it for white-box testing? Is it extra effort?
Yeah, well, one of the things is that these server configuration issues that you get a lot, they are usually the output of automated testing tools. So manual testing is the way to go if you want these more deeper lying vulnerabilities, and the better manual tests, of course, start with the better information up front. So that would always be a gray box or a white box test. Another thing to take into account is that there's a lot that you can do yourself before you even have the pen testers come. So if you have the source code, which often you have, if it's not some off-the-shelf or customized application from a third-party vendor, you can run this through source code checkers yourself. So the SAST tooling, so SonarQube, for instance, is a tool that is often used for this. So you can get rid of most of these findings on a server level yourself way before that time by running your own sys baseline checks, by running your own SonarQube checks, and then you have the actual people with brains come in to do the real testing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a good segue into the other question. What if software code access is not feasible, specifically like a closed source API or something? What can be a good test approach and advice there?
Yeah. So if it's a closed source API, then 9 times out of 10, it turns out to be a reverse engineering effort. So that means that our testers will have to observe the traffic in an actual production environment where real requests are being made to the system, and we have to interpret those results, reverse engineer it, and then work from there. But that's significant more work than having the documentation up front.
Yes, I think you mentioned that in the slide as well. I mean, this would be a black box approach. The more information we have, the more value we can provide.
Yeah.
If there's no way to get access to the source code, we can do that as well, but it takes significantly more time and you might miss things still.
No, definitely. Yeah. Because if an API call is not performed during the time that you're observing it, you can't guess these things.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Could you explain some more on the specific aspects or new methods needed for pen testing in the cloud, which you say was an interest peaked in the future?
Yeah, so 2 aspects to take into account. One, I would say, is the interaction between various components in the cloud can introduce all kinds of new sorts of vulnerabilities. So we have, for instance, functions as a service, which are basically small nuggets of code that run in a virtualized environment that interact with other parts of the cloud. These things have to be tested in a different way than a static application, simply because they exist for only a short amount of time, have a limited time of interaction, and the way that they are called and used is totally different. So this is the case, for instance, with AWS Lambda services. Another aspect that is different in the cloud is the fact that the whole underlying cloud infrastructure is configured through your dashboard, basically. So you can set all kinds of things that are actually invisible to the naked eye when you look from the internet, but are deeply ingrained into the security structure of cloud. So, for instance, this pertains to, I would say, encryption of your data stores in the cloud, the way that your keys for that encryption are handled in the cloud, and also the way that your application is deployed in the cloud, because often that is done through a CI/CD or typically other kind of pipeline system. And yeah, that doesn't happen in normal quote unquote application environments. So the security of your application, of course, is dependent on how that is done, and that's very different in a cloud environment. So we have to look at more aspects.
Yeah. Speaking of the application, well, how would you recommend testing the business logic itself? That's something that you said tools would not be able to really discern.
Yeah.
What are some methods in testing for those business logic issues?
Well, the first thing I would say is to have a talk with the customer to find out what the actual business usage is of the application. So that means that you look at the functions, the specifications, what is it supposed to do, and then apply all kinds of normal again, logic to that. So is it logical that this user is allowed to do this and this? Yeah. Is it logical that when I go to this page, I can also access these parts of the application, even though I might not be able to do anything with it? So you have to, this is typically the human part of testing. Yeah, there's not really a methodology behind it, except that you can use, for instance, the ASVS controls to go through it methodologically, but the actual testing, it's people work.
Yeah, that's a good answer to close out on. And I think we're short on time, so this is the last question and answer. I do see some other questions still, so we will answer those afterwards. But
really good. Yep. So what we'll do is we'll answer those questions in the email, and you'll be receiving an answer to those later. Well, I guess tomorrow.
Yeah, and if there are any other questions, just put them in here as well. You can reach out to us, and we will get back to you on those. So with that, I would just like to thank everyone for joining. I hope it was useful and interesting. Definitely learning some new things, and well, have a very nice day.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. See you next time.